film Rolling Thunder from 1977 is an extraordinary character study about a man who has been whittled down into a detached and meaningless entity by the extreme emotional, mental, and physical horror he endured in a POW camp in Vietnam for 7 years. For a studio project turned quasi-grindhouse film, it deals with some rather tough subjects, one similarly touched upon a year earlier in Scorsese's Taxi Driver.
I'm trying you.
The subjects being the effects of PTSD and society's lack of understanding for those who were suffering from it, how those who suffer from PTSD try to alleviate their turmoil if they're in an environment which doesn't encourage emotional remedy, and the abrupt change that happened throughout America due to the effects of the Vietnam War. The film's strong points are its script and some surprisingly decent dramatic direction from the action maestro John Flynn. However, what really ignites this film are its performances, particularly William Devane's performance as Major Charles Rain. This video essay is meant to cover why Devane's performance, which has often been cited as wooden and lifeless, is in fact very layered and demonstrates a type of acting not often found in films today. When Charles Rain returns home and finds out his wife has had an affair, his response is mute. At first he's upset, and you can see he's holding back tears in the scene where she tells him about the affair.
And then it just seemed like the two of us just had to.
I knew. We all knew. Couldn't have been any other way.
After the confession, the film transitions to Rain lying on his bed, self-imposing the same institutionalized daily regime he held in captivity. It's as if this is the only way he knows how to cope with any trauma, whether it be physical, mental, or emotional. Eventually, Rain seems to detach completely, and love begins to mean nothing. The only thing that really matters now is his son, who's forgotten him completely, having not seen him since he was a toddler. It seems as though Rain sees salvation in a potential relationship with his son, and while Rain makes genuine attempts to rekindle the non-existent bond, he fails because he's unable to get connected on the emotional level necessary for a healthy father-son dynamic. In retrospect, this is probably the saddest aspect about the film, since a rekindled connection with his boy is what Rain initially believes will alleviate him of his pain. Yet he's just not able to do it. When the town awards Rain's bravery with a red Cadillac and $2,555 silver dollars, he reacts graciously and politely, but the money doesn't have any true value. In these scenes, Rain comes off as someone trying to emulate gratitude as opposed to genuinely feeling it. The scene which follows is between Rain and Cliff, the cop with whom Rain's wife has had the affair with and is going to marry. This is a really great scene because it's the first time we get a complete sense of who Rain really is. We also get to know Cliff, who embodies the characteristics of a man who is following the template of the 1950s male, blissfully unaware of the types of experiences Rain and others who have seen war firsthand have endured. There are moments where Cliff tries to relate to Rain through generic sound bites, but he comes off as completely ignorant.
I mean, I've been in some scrapes. I know what I can do. But, well, anyone who wasn't over there has to ask himself if he could have taken it. You know, getting tortured and all.
They are two men on polar opposite sides of the spectrum. Cliff still believes in apple pie and Ralph Cramden, and there's one line that really demonstrates this ignorance, where Cliff says,
"You know, you're lucky. You're lucky they didn't ruin you for life."
Rain just looks down and says nothing for a few seconds. Through this line of dialogue, Cliff really encapsulates the ignorance of much of the American public at the time. He's totally unaware of post-traumatic stress and its long-term effects on the human psyche. Instead of punching Cliff out, Rain responds to Cliff's ignorance by tricking Cliff into participating in a type of torture inflicted upon him in the POW camp. Though what makes this scene so intense is the fact that Cliff isn't the one in the submissive position. but rather Rain, who's chosen to endure the agony.
I tied your arms behind you. So here, help me out. Give me a hand. Just help me out. Tie that arm to this one real close. Okay.
For the awkward and dim-witted Cliff, he complies at first as a means of trying to get on Rain's good side, but it quickly turns into an uncomfortable, authentic execution that results in Cliff having to stop, desperately trying to contain his distress and trepidation.
That's enough.
Rain then says something very telling and profound.
You learn to love the rope. That's how you beat him. That's how you beat people who torture you. You learn to love them. And they don't know you're beating them.
Rain shows no emotion about the murder of his family and the disfigurement of his hand because he's taught himself to not feel. This is a man who has been forced to convince himself not to feel pain, sorrow, or even anger. Rain sees what's happened to him as a means to make up for all the suffering he's endured. More than avenging his wife, himself, or even his son, he feels that through exacting punishment on the killers, he'll relieve the suppressed rage which he's wrestled to cope with for the past 7 years. Several weeks after the attack, Rain is visited in the hospital by fellow POW survivor Johnny Bowden, played by a young Tommy Lee Jones. We learn in this scene that Bowden has signed on for another 10 years in the Airborne Division, due to his uncertainty as to what else to do with his life. The film really shows off its ability to convey so much, so minimally, in the quick dialogue between Rain and Bowden.
How's your wife?
Real good. Oh, it's hard getting used to home life again, you know, getting used to being a woman.
He stops himself and there's an awkward silence. Rain adjusts his glasses and seems to either pretend to not be listening, out of embarrassment for Bowden opening up, or just hasn't even noticed what Bowden has said since his level of connection with everyone has become so paper thin. It's a small yet very integral scene. It shows how these men are not only incapable of expressing themselves to their loved ones, but can also find no comfort in expressing themselves to each other.
They'll catch him, some bitches, Major. They'll catch him.
I suppose.
Can't just let it slide, Major. They don't have any right to live.
Hi.
Linda, played by Linda Haynes, is a rather dynamic female character not typically found in your common action revenge flick. She also represents a facet to the naivete and ignorance that Cliff embodies, although her ignorance isn't insulting but comes more from a place of innocence. Haynes gives a really great performance that anchors the entire film. She's even more of a vehicle for the audience than Rain because she's the most open and is still in touch with her own humanity. Earlier in the film, when Rain and Linda had their first conversation in the bar, there was this sense that Rain detected a feeling of nostalgic happiness in Linda's youthful innocence. He's awkwardly polite the same way he was at the ceremony, but there's a difference in the way he holds himself. He's less standoffish, and while he's not at all open and seems to be offended by her come on, he tells her he'll visit her again.
We'll come back and see me now, okay? Wednesday through Sunday night.
Sure, I'll be glad.
And there's a distinct warmth in his voice. Linda serves as a grounding for Rain. By bringing her on his mission, the film suggests that in order for Rain to commit these murders, he's going to have to keep that feeling of innocence around as a means of grounding, to save him from completely losing what's left of his mind, or, more importantly, his soul. An hour or so into the film, we get a scene between Rain and Linda in the back seat of the Cadillac. They're listening to the radio when Rain suddenly says,
I remember that song from when I was alive.
Alive?
That's what we used to call the time before we were captured.
It's on the nose, but this is a pivotal moment since Rain is finally opening up, being vulnerable, seemingly without the awareness of even doing so. In this scene, the entire tone of the film shifts from being a typical slow-burn 70s action flick, where all you're doing is waiting for the next fight scene, to a road movie about looking for answers without even knowing the real questions. After Rain and Linda make love, Rain again opens up to Linda.
It's like my eyes are open and I'm looking at you, but I'm dead.
Linda suggests that they go somewhere cold, like Alaska. Just forget about the mission and live in peace. When she asks Rain if he'll take them, he doesn't say anything. He sees how unprepared Linda is. Rain's also become connected to Linda and feels responsible. He's realized that she still doesn't really understand why he's on the mission in the first place, and it's in fact good that she doesn't. It's my impression that Rain leaves in the morning because he has rediscovered something that he hasn't felt for the past 7 years, a real human connection. While he claims he's dead, it's clear he's become emotionally attached. He's grown to genuinely care for Linda's safety. Throughout this trip, we've constantly gotten a sense of conflict in Rain regarding his relationship dynamic with Linda. There's definitely something there, though he seems to have feared that if he indulged in it, then he'd become connected and thus distracted from his mission. This was shown in the scenes where Rain would get up and leave whenever a conversation between he and Linda would get personal. Even in the scene in the back of the Cadillac where he seems most at ease and most open, the film immediately transitions to him practicing with his sawed-off shotgun. It's as if the film itself doesn't even want him to get distracted from his mission. Now that Rain's suppressed connection with Linda has materialized, he feels responsible for her, and knows that if he lets her stay with him, she'll likely either die or be preview to horrors which will result in the corruption of her innocence, the main quality that Rain has grown to love. It's a good thing that Rain has left Linda, and I think she realizes this during her attempt to get in contact with the sheriff's department. Linda recognizes what he's done for her and also perhaps realizes the subtext to Rain's mission and why he feels more than destined to complete it. Once Linda has left the picture, we know that our protagonist is not going to experience the metamorphosis he had hoped for. Rain quickly reunites with his fellow POW veteran, Johnny Bowden. Tommy Lee Jones's performance, much like Devane's, is completely void of all emotion and purpose. That is, until the bullets start flying. Bowden, like Rain, has become apathetic towards everything and everyone. He too has learned to bottle up his emotions, to love the horror, and it has gotten to a point, telling by the painstakingly awkward dinner conversation with his family, where he has lost a passion for everyone and everything. It is in the climax and denouement of the picture where we become completely aware of what the film's message is. Rain and Bowden find the killers in a whorehouse and commence in a killing spree. The similarities between this scene and the one at the end of Taxi Driver demonstrate how when all hope is lost, all that is left is violent and explosive rage. Both Jones and Devane give intense performances in this particular scene, but it is Jones who really shines. Bowden infiltrates the saloon posing as a customer and is led up to a room. There's a short dialogue between he and the prostitute where she tells him to relax, and he just looks at her and smiles. The same disturbing grin shows up again near the end of the shootout. Jones conveys in a mere facial expression where this man's purpose lies, not in mundane dinner conversations or ordinary life. The act of destruction, terror, and violence is the only element to life withstanding any meaning in Bowden. Once the killing stops, so does Bowden. While Jones's performance certainly steals the spotlight for the majority of the scene, it is Devane's final act that somberly sums up the film. Once Rain has killed Automatic Slim by shooting him at close range a few times in the chest, he pulls the trigger one last time. It clicks. No more bullets. There weren't enough bullets, and there never will be. Rain and Bowden help each other out of the brothel while the credits roll over and an upbeat folk song plays. One could dismiss this as an unfitting and dated ending to an otherwise good film. The song's heroic nature is pretty awkward, but that's why it works so well. The entire scenario undermining the scene cleverly contrasts the blunt reality with the then current movie-going expectations. Ideally, Devane and Jones would have lighted up some cigars, shot the shit, and felt good about themselves. Instead, they're just as meaningless and as devoid from feeling as they were before. I recently watched Alexander Payne's film Nebraska with Bruce Dern. It seems random to bring up, but I mention it because while I was watching it, something came to me. Specifically as I watched Dern. I bring up Dern's performance because he came from the same generation of actors as Devane. This generation seemed to be more focused on serving the work rather than themselves. They didn't take time to pout their lips or furrow their brow at the camera. In Rolling Thunder, Devane is a man who just can't connect anymore and has no way of exercising his turmoil in a healthy way. In Nebraska, Dern was a man who simply believed what people told him, but it wasn't acting. To call it that would undermine it. It was just being. I recently read something by Kevin B. Lee, and I'm going to paraphrase it. When discussing Nebraska, I believe Kevin referred to Dern's performance as not just naturalism or the method, but something else, something without answers, but in fact more questions. What does this old man think of when he sees that broken chair in his old room?
You remember that, Dad?
I was there.
I think the same applies to Devane's performance. What does this man see when he looks at his son, whom he hasn't seen in 7 years? What's going through his head when he tries to put his cigarette back into the box, only with the use of his hooked hand? What are these men thinking? What are they seeing? Devane and Dern both came from a class of acting that is not just for entertainment, not just for spectacle. They came from a class which now feels like a lost art. Not the art of acting, but rather the art of mystery. As Kevin called it, the mystery that great movies can bring to life, the mystery of life itself. Rolling Thunder, while not a masterpiece, was certainly a culturally significant film. Maybe not as much as Taxi Driver, The Deer Hunter, Coming Home, Apocalypse Now, or even Birdie, but still significant. While the film isn't as necessarily good as any of the other films previously mentioned, it certainly has something the others don't. What separates Rolling Thunder is its separateness. It's inviting, but by not being so at all. We're dealing with a man who can't experience life any other way, who's come home to a country that's in no better shape than he is. American idealism during the Vietnam War suddenly became archaic. America lost the innocence it had in the 1940s, 50s, and early 60s. The world began to see the U.S. military as antagonists rather than saviors because of things like My Lai and a ton of Vietnamese children being born with defects due to the chemicals used by U.S. forces, specifically Agent Orange. Protests at home started putting pressure on the Nixon administration to leave Vietnam for the Vietnamese to handle. Nixon was already being criticized by other countries for America's escalated involvement in Vietnam, so people began questioning the credibility of the man whom they were told they were meant to believe in. All the primary characters in Rolling Thunder are sort of stuck in this cultural cluster, and none know how to resolve their traumas or make it go back to the way it used to be. Linda wants to just run away, and Rain thinks that salvation will only be achieved once he exercises his pent-up rage, and they're both wrong. Those who were affected by the Vietnam War would never be able to return to that same innocence and cultural idealism of the past. What makes Rolling Thunder such a great film is how it communicates this with more subtlety than even the best Vietnam War films. Where most war films contain a distinct vision, Rolling Thunder does not. Where most war films have a clear sense of feeling, Rolling Thunder does not. Where most war films fail in the absence of evident emotion and artistic expression, Rolling Thunder succeeds.
Someday you'll be up to